Seems like I'm going to be the last presenter before the last panel. I'm going to talk about a little bit about young researchers and the open polar world and how it is like to be a student and start getting into polar research these days. Yeah. And I thought I would start off with how I got involved in the polar field in Estonia. So, as you have probably heard, Katrin talked about it, Estonian Polar Club organizes polar quizzes. And I was one of the members on the very first one in 2017. And I was one of the, five students that ended up going to one of the expeditions. So I ended up going to Finland, to Kilpisjärvi, and went to Tromsø, and it was a really cool experience, and that was probably one of the first times when I actually started thinking that doing polar stuff might actually be possible, and it's something that I would be interested in. And after that, I ended up going to study in Scotland, and in my university, we had a chance to do an exchange year, or exchange semester, and one of the options was Norway. And one of the places you could go to in Norway was Svalbard. And Rico was talking about it, so you probably have seen this building already on some of the pictures. Rico was talking about UNIS. So I ended up going to Svalbard, and I studied at UNIS, so the University Center in Svalbard. And that was probably one of the coolest things I could have done at the time. It was a really cool way to get into research and to get sort of a bit of an overview of what was happening. And UNIS is one of the universities that's very heavily focused on research and getting sort of practical, hands-on experience out in the field. The very first thing, probably the first month I was there, we ended up going around the whole Svalbard archipelago, looking for different plants and having some projects. So each of us got the group, and everyone ended up doing a project and carrying out the whole project in those 5 days that we went around Svalbard. It was great fun. You got to see a lot, and you got to learn a lot. There was a lot of Latin names of plants, which I somehow still remember, which was apparently was a pretty good study. And with UNIS, because there's such a heavy emphasis on research, every course has quite a bit of fieldwork and quite a bit of research. So I ended up having a chance to try out a lot of different things. We ended up going on ships for a few weeks, week at a time, but over the years it has piled up. So we tried out different things in marine biology, got to do some studies on sea ice, so you got to try out how it is to take a sea ice core. One of the floes ended up being about 15 centimeters thick, and we just plopped through with ice core, and we're like, oh, this is a bit too thin, we should probably leave, and we just left. So it was a lot of learning, and it's a really good opportunity to kind of try out different things and figure out what you would be interested in. So we got to go out and take some trawls, see some really weird stuff, some brain-looking snails that come out of those trawls. There's a lot of weird stuff out in the sea that you wouldn't really imagine that's there. Got to figure out that looking at phytoplankton with the ship under a microscope when the ship is moving is not the nicest thing. It's pretty tricky to count the eggs of zooplankton when they're moving around while looking at them. And yeah, I got to learn a lot of different things. Got to learn how to drive a snow scooter, because we did some reindeer studies with that, which maybe were not the most fruitful studies, because we ended up going out in a snowstorm trying to count reindeer, and the only reindeer we saw was our teacher dressed up as a reindeer trying to pretend to be one. So we would at least find one, because all the other ones were gone at that specific time. And I stayed a whole year there, and I decided that I very much liked it. And I ended up going back, so now I've been there for about 6 years. And ended up writing both my bachelor and my master's thesis up in Svalbard. And I ended up helping out with some fieldwork. And when you're in Svalbard, one of the main things is that you can't go on fieldwork if you're a terrestrial biologist without a dog. So This is my field companion, Charlotte. So I had 3 dogs that I would take out with me on field work. And I was helping out in the biology department as a field assistant. I was helping out with a lot of vegetation recording studies. So there's some studies happening that they're going back to the same plots year after year, a bit like what Peter was talking about, and looking how the species composition has changed. And there's also studies on how they're sort of mimicking warming, similar to what Peter was showing with the open-top chambers that are warming up the ground and doing some sort of mimicking goose grubbing, sort of just picking up some vegetation to see what that does to the species composition and what it does to the permafrost underneath that. So it was the first time when you could actually do something with the real research in that sense that you had, I had a proper part in it. And it was really cool. And I decided that I really liked it. I also helped out with one of my friends who was incredibly stubborn and decides that she wanted to do a study on glaciers and see if she wanted to study microbes on glaciers and look at the sediment on glaciers. And everybody in the unis told her that she probably won't find anything, and she's been trying for 2 years now. And she has found some stuff, but we realized that, it was maybe not the smartest decision for a master thesis when the fieldwork has taken about over 2 years now. But I was her trusted field assistant because unis wouldn't really let anyone else go out with her because it was so tricky. So whenever they see us coming in, they start laughing, and they're like, okay, what are you guys doing? You're going out on the glacier again? Okay, whatever, you can manage that. So that's what we're doing here. We're digging snow pits and going down to the glacier, chopping off ice and looking for sediments that we marked in the summertime. And I also ended up writing my master thesis and my bachelor thesis in Svalbard, and I was part of a project called Bjørndalen Integrated Gradients. So it's a valley near Longyearbyen where there's quite a lot of different studies going on, looking at different aspects of that area. What I was working with was the plant side of the things. So we have some time-lapse cameras that are observing the same individual plants over the years. So they've been observing them since 2019, so a few years now. And there's loads of students. So the teachers, they like to use students to go out and change the batteries of the cameras or pick up the nets, pick up the traps for insects, because they're also monitoring insects there. And obviously, as students, there's a cabin there. And we used all the opportunities we could to stay in that cabin overnight and pretend that we were doing something very important, that we had to stay in the cabin overnight. But I ended up writing my thesis actually on insects. Because I mentioned we have those time-lapse cameras that we were using to monitor Silena caulis plants, so the moss campion, so the purple flowering plant here. And when I wrote my bachelor thesis on that plant, I was just clicking through the pictures to see how long those flowers would be open. And we realized that we actually ended up capturing also insects, not only the flowers, but also insects. My study was looking at the pictures of the flowers to look for insects, to see if those insects have daily activity patterns, if they're more abundant at certain times of the day or not, because nobody had really looked into that. And it was really cool. And that was the first time we kind of got into a bit more real research. And as a student, it was really cool to see that the stuff that you were doing, so the data I was collecting ended up being used in a few different studies. So as a student who was interested in research, it was really cool to start off with going on the courses and learning everything, then getting a bit more responsibility and sort of doing a bit more research on your own, collecting the data, and then going through the whole sort of system and seeing how it ends up being a paper. So as a student, it was a really cool experience. But the second part of my talk my title was about the open polar world. The pictures are not here. Anyway, so the second part was also about the open polar world. And I think being able to go to UNIS, it opened up the polar world for me, really opened up the whole way into the polar world, but as a lot of the students these days, I actually ended up being a guide on the side. And I would say that this is another thing that really has opened up the polar world for me, because everybody knows that the world is changing. The sea ice is declining quite rapidly, and there's more and more ships going up to the Arctic, and there's more interest for people, for tourists as well, to go in those areas, because they're a lot more accessible than they used to be. In Svalbard, for example, there's about 80,000 people visiting every summer by ships. There's a lot of people coming up here, and this tourism is opening up the world for sort of normal people. And what I've seen, a lot of my coworkers have actually been former researchers. And because the ships are going to those areas, they're going there anyway, they've started to include some scientists in those trips as well. So they started using citizen science projects. There's been, for example, like in Bellingshausen's case, the ships were going there anyway, and they ended up collecting data for scientists elsewhere. And with the work I've done on guiding ships, it's really cool to see how there's a really big interest in the polar areas, and the people that come to those places, they really want to learn more. But oftentimes with science, scientists do the science, and then it ends up staying just in the sort of science circle. And having this access, for the people having access to come to those places, they want to know that, but they don't really know where to start from, where to learn about those places. So they're always really eager to learn, and it's been really cool to take what I've learned at school as this really theoretical thing and talk to real people and talk and explain to them how things work and how the system works, how the ecosystem works, how everything works, and to see this sort of spark of people getting really interested in those topics. And a lot of the times, some of my coworkers, they have ended up getting funding for their sort of popular science projects because they've been in contact with people that come on the ship. So they've gotten some funding to do podcasts or start sort of projects that are going across the different oceans, because nowadays there is a lot more access to those pretty remote areas because of the tourism. So that was kind of what I wanted to talk about, how it is very interesting to have those opportunities nowadays to get into research, and how there's different ways to open up the whole polar area to science, or sort of just to open it up to people to experience it. And it's pretty exciting to have all those opportunities. And thank you very much for having me here as well.